what is science?
For centuries, science was controlled by the church, a fanatical church. If we look at history, we find that there's a very strong tendency to contaminate science with religion. And they still think, many of them, that philosophy of science is sort of a nuisance. You may not study psychology, but you have a psychology.
I was listening just a short video by Elon Musk. He was saying, I don't know what will happen to the human race. So welcome everyone, whoever is watching from wherever in the world. I am Dr. Pawan Upadhyay, your host today. Today's guest is very special. Is Dr. S.D. Goswami. He's PhD from Harvard University and an academic dean of Bhaktivedanta Institute, USA. We'll go very soon into his whole details. So his journey started several decades back. So as a young student in Berkeley, he was involved in student revolution of late 60s. Dr. S.D. Goswami met his guru, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Srila Prabhupada, and began the serious practice of Bhakti Yoga in 1969. Most of us may not be even born that time. And Srila Prabhupada, you can just search who is Srila Prabhupada. You just search out, you'll find hundreds of things about him. He encouraged him to complete his academic education at that time in Berkeley and to present Krishna consciousness to educated people like us, right? So later he finished his BA from UCLA in world religion and then completed the fastest PhD in the history of Sanskrit and Indian studies at the department at Harvard University, where I am right now here. So Harvard has also published his articles on Prabhupada's translation style, also published his doctoral dissertation in prestigious Harvard Oriental series. He then taught Sanskrit and Bhagavad Gita at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley and was a visiting scholar in Indo-European studies at UCLA and taught the history of Indian religion at the University of Florida. In terms of service to ISKCON, Goswami took sannyas in 1972 at the age of 23. At that time, we planned to marry most of people, right? And then he lectured for 2 years at US universities. And in 1974, at the age of 25, he was appointed by Srila Prabhupada as the GBC, who is the governing body commission for International Society for Krishna Consciousness, in short called ISKCON, in all Latin America. It's a big, almost 24 countries, 25 countries I see here, 25 countries. And under his leadership, dozens of temples were established, millions of Prabhupada books were translated, published, and distributed. If you are from ISKCON, then I must add it. I think he did not directly mention. So Srila Prabhupada finished till first canto, almost half of it, first 10th canto of half part. Till then Srila Prabhupada finished Bhagavatam. And after that, Dr. S.D. Goswami took over along with more friends and God brothers and finished the whole 12th canto. So that's what we have. You can understand his wisdom, knowledge in various areas. That's on his spiritual side. But today we are going to delve into more on scientific side of reality. So in 1977, Prabhupada named him to serve as a guru upon Prabhupada's departure. He was the one of the first group of gurus appointed by Srila Prabhupada. So how close he was and he is with Srila Prabhupada. In addition to lecturing around the world, Goswami now serves as the academic dean of Bhaktivedanta Institute and has published a multi-volume historical novel called Great Bharata. So whoever is listening to the podcast, I would say you should search Great Bharata. It has been recently launched in audio version. There is an app. You can get it in his own voice, Dr. Goswami's voice. You will hear the nectarian history of Bharata in very lucid language and with more of detail and especially with modern situation, how it is, useful. So I would surely ask all of you to definitely look for this book. And if you don't have time to read, just plug in your headphone and listen the whole series. He also constructing a powerful team of academic scholars to present Krishna consciousness in the language of contemporary philosophy. That's what his current quest. So all of you get comfortable now and open your mind as and join us as we embark on this quest together. So today's topic, we are tackling a fundamental question, very fundamental. You may wonder what is in it, right? So the topic today is, what is science? Sounds like silly, right? Everybody knows, it seems like, but let's see. And then next question is, what is pseudoscience? Most of don't believe in it. We think scientists think everything is science, and then non-scientists think everything is pseudoscience, right? So there is a huge space to talk about. So we'll touch that. So in this era, as you know, that COVID time, we have seen a whole science and pseudoscience at display, right? Several people lost life because of so many confusions. But so here we have information. You can search in Google. You'll find jillions of things, right? For anything you ask for. It becomes hard to discern what is genuine scientific inquiry versus what is pseudoscientific claim. Science and pseudoscience might seem familiar to you at first glance, right? Because we are just looking at one side of the coin, but they are fundamentally different as you go on to understand their approach, method, and outcome. So today we are going to explore that difference and delve into criteria that define true science and understand why pseudoscience often appears convincing. So with that, that's the kind of give you a background, and we are joined by Dr. H.D. Goswami. Again, just to remind about our guest, who is PhD from Harvard and academic dean of Bhaktivedanta Institute, USA. And he is going to help us to navigate this critical question and distinction. So welcome, Dr. H.D. Goswami, to our inaugural podcast episode today. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you. So thank you for that introduction. I'll just begin. Won't waste anyone's time. As far as the question, what is science? I think that there is a wide agreement on the basic methodology of empiric science. I don't think, or empirical science or induction, I don't think that's really controversial. The controversy is that if we look at history, we find that there's a very strong tendency to contaminate science with religion. And that religion may be theist or atheist. For example, the examples of, say, religion contaminating science are very well known, because when you take classes in the university, they endlessly tell you about Galileo and how and they don't tell you why Galileo was actually convicted. It was mostly because he was so obnoxious and offensive toward the Pope, not because of his heliocentrism. But in any case, there is a phenomenon, very well-known phenomenon, which is called at times the pendulum effect, a term which was coined around the time of Galileo. And even before that, Plato talks about this. The philosopher Plato says that, talking about political systems such as tyranny or democracy or oligarchy and so on, that political extremes tend to generate their opposite, so that tyranny tends to produce anarchy, anarchy tends to produce tyranny, and so on. And then again, we find that in Newton, I think it's Newton's third law of motion, that every force in the universe creates an equal and opposite force. Or, for example, the great philosopher of history, or wannabe philosopher of history, Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel, who said that he introduced the idea of this dialectic process: thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. And then, of course, in the 20th century, there's a very famous book by Thomas Kuhn, the Nature of Scientific Revolutions, which also talks about this. So the point I'm driving at is that if you look at history, just taking this dialectic process, this action and reaction, that for centuries science was controlled by the church, a fanatical church. And so, for example, long after it was disproved, scientists were required in church dominated Europe to teach Ptolemy's astronomy, epicycles, and so on. Or so because and so gradually science advanced so much, and what really convinced people in general, what really gained power for science was not merely their equations or theories, but it was the applied science. It was the applied science in the form of the Industrial Revolution. And so I'm mentioning all this just to show that there's a political, historical aspect to what we believe is objective. And so the pendulum swung all the way to the other extreme. So instead of having empirical science contaminated by, let's say, church dogma, now we have empirical science contaminated by another church dogma, which is the church dogma of atheistic physicalism. And in the United States, legally, in the United States, atheism can be a religion. There are atheistic groups that get tax exemption for their atheistic groups. And so, in order to understand all this, just one more point, and then I'm just sort of trying to set the scene here. If you look at history, what we find is that in the 19th century, that it was understood that if you're a serious scientist, you also have to study philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Because one thing is to do an experiment, you can do an empirical test. And I don't think we're going to disagree on the basic parameters of, empirical testing. What constitutes a valid test and so on and so forth. That's pretty straightforward. But if you don't study philosophy, because in the 20th century, because science was so successful, it became very proud, hubris. Pride goes before the fall. And they thought that, and they still think, many of them, that philosophy of science is sort of a nuisance. Like we are self-sufficient, we are autonomous, objectivity is in our hands, and anyone who wants to make an objective statement about anything has to pass through the gatekeepers of objectivity who are empirical scientists. Now, this became formalized as a philosophy, which had various names. It came to be called logical positivism. And it became very prominent philosophically in the 1920s in Vienna in a group of top scientists and mathematicians who called themselves, or they were called the Wienkreis, which in German means the Vienna Circle. And so they made the claim that nothing can be accepted as an objective truth unless it can be empirically verified.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you say something like there's a soul in the body, or God created the world, or that it's objectively wrong, let's say, to kill innocent people, which is a metaphysical claim. It's not an empirical claim. Let's say, for example, let's say this person kills that person, and then they bring in the forensic experts. And the forensic experts, they can tell you everything. Okay, the person was killed by a bullet. The bullet entered the body here, exited the body there, causing, whatever trauma that led to the death of this person. And it happened at this time of day, at this angle. You can go through all the forensic information, but none of that scientific data will tell you that it was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was evil, that it was bad to kill this innocent person. And so when you don't study philosophy, you unknowingly say things which are philosophically very stupid. It's just like, so for example, you may not study psychology, but you have a psychology. You can't say because I don't study psychology, I don't have one. In fact, if you don't study it, you're probably going to, have problems. So same way, you may not study philosophy, but it doesn't mean you don't have one. In fact, it's impossible to do science without having a philosophy of science. I'll explain how that's the case.
Yeah, because the PhD is doctorate in philosophy, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So they've become, basically, science has become philosophically illiterate, not to say stupid. I'll give you an example. In order to do science in earnest, you have to make certain metaphysical assumptions. And I'll just a word on metaphysics, because unless you understand metaphysics in this sense, you can't really understand anything about the philosophy of science. This was first brought up by a gentleman named Aristotle 2,500 years ago. Aristotle said that whatever you claim to be true, you can be driven into an infinite regress of proofs of your claim. And to give a very simple example, very simple science, you claim that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Some can say, prove it. So you put a pot of water on the stove and you put in a thermometer and the water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. But then the person could say, how do I know that's real water? Maybe you added some chemical that changes the boiling point.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to test the water. And of course, you have to test the mercury also to make sure it's really mercury. And then you have to test the water testing chemical. Then you have to, and so you're pushed into an infinite and by the way, Lord Chaitanya made the same point. And so you're pushed into an infinite regress of proof. So Aristotle said, if you allow this regress to continue forever, you can never claim to know anything. And yet we do know things. And so he said the way you escape an infinite regress of proofs is that you have to make a stand and claim that some things are self-evident. They prove themselves, therefore they don't require extrinsic proof, and there's no regress. Now, Lord Chaitanya used the same term. When Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was speaking to two great scholars of his time, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya and Prakashananda, he said that the Vedas are swata pramana. They are self-evident, literally self-evident. So the point I'm driving at is, in order for you to do science, you have to assume certain things. You have to claim that certain facts are self-evident, facts that you cannot empirically prove. Mm-hmm. For example, the fact that there's a real world outside your mind. Descartes brought this up actually in the 1600s, that what if you are simply a brain in the laboratory of an evil genius? And what if there is no Earth? You're on a different planet. There are no universities. You have no family. You're not from India. You're not in Boston. All this is just you're being programmed by, as Descartes said, an evil genius in a laboratory. And nowadays in philosophy, they talk about the brain in the vat. So the point is, you can't empirically prove that there's a real world outside your mind, because, to give an example, let's say here is a pen, writing pen. So if I say, okay, I can prove there's a real world. Look, this is a real pen. No, philosophically, that's absurd. It's circular reasoning. And so what I mean by circular reasoning is a syllogism, the basic form, let's say, of deductive logic is, the example that's always given is that if you agree that human beings are mortal, human beings die. That's an empirical fact. Human beings are mortal. And let's say John is a human being. Therefore, it must be the case that John is mortal.
Yes.
In other words, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Circular reasoning, if the premises are true, like for example, if I say John is a man and John is a bachelor, therefore it must be the fact that John is unmarried. Because if he's a man, because bachelor is a term for men. If I say Mary is not married, I wouldn't say Mary is a bachelor. But if it's the case that John is a man and John is not married, it must be true that John is a bachelor.
Yeah.
So if I say, look, but here's the problem. If I say I can prove there's a real world outside my mind because this is a real pen. However, if you have a syllogism, a logical proof, where the premise states the conclusion, because to say this is a real pen, but this is a real pen only if there's a real physical world.
Yes.
But that there's a real physical world is the conclusion I'm trying to prove. So I can't give the conclusion as proof of itself. And therefore, the argument is going around in a circle. And so, if someone is not logically illiterate and is not foolish, they know that to do empirical science, you must assume or you must claim that you know self evidently, not by empirical proof, there's a real physical world. You must also believe, for example, somehow in time and space. Another thing you can't prove empirically is yesterday.
Mm.
Or, for example, you can't prove that other people have minds. How will you empirically prove that? You can't prove empirically that it's wrong, let's say, to kill innocent people. So no one actually lives in a physicalist world. It's utter hypocrisy. And I'll prove to you that you cannot actually live a human life unless you have metaphysical values. You wake up in the morning. Okay, let's say you go to sleep, you dream, you wake up. You can't empirically prove that your wakened state is more real than your dream because your dream is not empirically available, the world of your dream. So you can't prove that. And let's say you make a very momentous decision when you wake up. You decide to get out of bed. Now, even deciding to get out of bed is a value judgment. You get out of bed, in other words, you exercise your free will. You get out of bed because you decide that it is better, totally non empirical idea, better. It is better to get out of bed than to stay in bed. Let's say you decide to become a scientist. You decide to take a job. You decide to get married, or you decide not to get married. Those are all metaphysical judgments. They're value judgments. And values are not empirical. They're not, it's a value is not water or stone or fire or, methane gas. It's a value. It's metaphysical. Therefore, every one of us that exercises free will, any one of us that holds any values whatsoever is living in a bi-dimensional universe.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, what we can see is that physicalists, not to say that physicalism has become a really absurd position since or say materialism, because we don't know what matter is. Quantum mechanics just kind of hit this wall, as we know. Is it a particle? Is it a field of energy? Is it a wave? They just, they hit this wall, and then it's like those little wind-up toys have been bumping against this wall for about 100 years now. So my point is that no one is really a physicalist because they're just philosophically illiterate and don't know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So anyway, that was my little
no,
introduction.
that's very thought provoking, and a lot of questions one may have around it. So the summary I'm kind of understanding here is the modern science, what you call science, is primarily philosophy less. Like it's almost
Or
lacking.
I would say no. If it was philosophy less, that would be a big improvement.
So they
It's
have a
act.
philosophy. They have a
It's
philosophy which they manufacture for their own convenience, like what they
yeah, they are out of ignorance. They are hypocritical.
hypocritical. Okay, so that's right, Trump. Basically, so it's like everybody is concocting their own philosophy based on what they want to prove, right?
But they don't know they're doing that.
Yeah.
To give one simple example, let me give one simple. Let's say you're teaching algebra, and someone claims that x plus 2y equals r. I'm just making this up.
Yes. Yes.
X plus 2y equals r. Now, if you say this is a valid equation, or if you say it's not a valid equation, in both cases you're making a claim about algebra. If you have
Yes.
a child in school who takes a spelling test, if the teacher says this word is spelled correctly or this word is not spelled correctly, that's a spelling claim. 2 plus 2 is 5. If you say that's wrong, it means you're claiming to know the real 2 plus 2. So, in the same way, if you say, for example, take an example we can maybe be detached about. Someone claims, let's say you're teaching in a public university where you can't teach religion, you can't preach in a public university, and you say, Zeus is the god of thunder.
Mm-hmm.
And someone says, no, you can't say that. It's a religious claim. But if you say, as all the teachers do in public schools and universities, Zeus, there is no Zeus, that is equally a religious claim.
Yeah.
It's equally so in other words, because of this hypocrisy, you can teach religion in public schools as long as you're teaching negative religion.
Okay.
So basically, the educators, scientists, they're just philosophically illiterate, don't know what they're talking about, and therefore science is contaminated by a religion, which is called physicalism.
Mm-hmm.
Religion because it's a metaphysical system that makes non-empirical claims.
Okay.
And so what's and just to round it out, getting back to my original point about the pendulum effect, science was contaminated by a fanatical religion back, say, 1500s, 1600s. And then by this pendulum effect, now science is contaminated by another religion which is making wild metaphysical claims. You take the fossil record. Let's say we agree on the fossil record. We agree on how old the bones are. We agree that probably the archaeological, the reconstructions of anatomies based on the fossil record are fairly accurate. None of that tells you that it happened by itself. As soon as you make the claim this ultimately happened by natural causes, you are no longer in the physical realm. You're in the metaphysical realm. You're making a religious claim. And
Yes.
so those are my points.
So essentially, what we take from here, that okay, they have a scientific inquiry, what they call science. They have a method which they follow, but then it is contaminated by biasness or their own preconceived ideas which they want to prove it. So basically, what I'm trying to get into is, how do we define a true science? Like, what are the criteria? Suppose if somebody wants to say, okay, or test, okay, is this science is a true science which can stand the test of any
Right.
time? So what would
Well,
be those criteria? And
yeah,
then we
first of
judge the
all,
pseudoscience.
stand the test of time. Good luck. If you look at the history of science, in other words, let's say you combine two chemicals and you get a certain result. That will stand the test of time. Your interpretation of why that happened, in other words, what you can say for sure, what will stand the test of time is, I took this chemical, I added that chemical, and this is what I got. That will stand the test of time. The theoretical explanation, well, that's because of the atoms and molecules and these particular laws of nature. That may not stand. There may ultimately be a better explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, if you look at Ptolemy's astronomy thousands of years ago, where he talked about epicycles. He was trying to explain planetary motion and the cycles of the zodiac and everything. And so, in terms of planetary motion, he thought, okay, they're epicycles, and for many centuries, that allowed perfect predictions of the locations of the planets, which they needed to, like, when is it a holy day, or when is it going to be the solstice, when is it going to be the equinox. For various reasons, they wanted to know these things. And so he had a system of epicycles. The planets are not only going around the sun, they're going around in little sort of, junior cycles. And it worked for centuries. It gave them complete predictive power. That was science. And if you said it wasn't true, you were a fool and could never get a job at any university. Now, the problem is that he didn't know about precession, which is that, everything goes around. It's not exactly in a year time. So over time, you get this growing inaccuracy.
Mm.
And that's why the church itself was asked Copernicus to figure it out. The church was actually not against heliocentrism. So you get this very perverted idea of what was going on historically. In science classes, they always talk about Galileo and the trial of Galileo. So, but the point is, you can have a theory. We may have a scientific theory today, let's say a quantum theory, and it may give perfect predictability for centuries, for 500 years, but ultimately it's wrong.
So ultimately, it is not perfect, and that's what scientific community claims. When they claim something, they add a disclaimer. Oh, it is evolving. It is
Yes.
evolving, right? With the knowledge, they don't fully claim what they know is 100% true, but they say that, oh, it will evolve, it will change.
Yes. But the one thing they do claim to be true, and they fight for, is their materialism, which is a religious philosophy. And the reason they fight for it is, you see, because let's say, for example, you have your family. So in your family and my family and every family, sometimes there are disagreements, sometimes there are arguments, real world. However, and they do that, people in the family, they may argue this, but if someone outside attacks the family, then everyone in the family will fight against that person together. The same way, you can argue about scientific theories as long as it's in the family. And in the family means atheistic materialism,
Yes.
physicalism. But as soon as you come from outside,
Yeah, they will attack together.
yeah. So let's say, for example, let's say the fossil record. I mean, they're basically, I'm happy to accept science. I don't have a better idea about truly empirical things. I accept it. So if you say that, okay, evolution occurred, here's the fossil record, and by the best dating systems we have, simpler creatures seem to have preceded more complex creatures. So that's fine. As soon as you say, and ultimately, this happened by purely natural causes, it is the one adverb. In this case, you could say it in other ways, other parts of speech, but in this case, it is the word ultimately that immediately transfers your claim from the physical realm to the metaphysical realm. Because there's nothing, in fact, scientists will say when it comes to evolution that, well, one argument they'll give is that vestigial traits, like let's say earlier creatures had tails, animals had tails. And so in the human anatomy, there's a vestige of a tail, like a little knob, which you can see using the tail. And so, but if God created the world, then it wouldn't be sloppy like that. You wouldn't have vestigial traits. It would be, everything would have its own unique purpose. But my point is simply this: when you make that claim, which they do, you're not talking science. You're making a theological claim. You're giving your opinion about the nature of God, that if God existed, God would be like this and would do that. So the atheists are such fools, pardon my language. They even, at least these people, they reserve the right to explain what kind of God doesn't exist. God doesn't exist, and if God did exist, God would be like that. That's not science, that's theology. That's theology. And so that's an example of how that's not science. So what I'm calling for is just science. Just do science. Don't pretend you're a philosopher. Don't pretend you're a theologian. Don't pretend you know what you don't know. And just give us science. It's like if you go to the doctor, let's say, because some condition, the doctor wants to start preaching religion to you. No, just give me the medical treatment.
Yeah.
You're not my priest, you're my doctor.
I mean, most of time scientists even don't talk about religion. They say I don't believe in it, right? Like the word come out like, I don't believe any of this.
However, no, that's true. Most scientists have families. Most scientists, have their job. They're just trying to live their life. However, there are spokespersons self-appointed spokespersons. So the extent to which let's say, people representing empirical science come into the public square
Hmm.
and argue.
Oh
And
yeah.
I'll give, yeah, and I'll give an example of a real world ramification. They dictate what you can say and not say in a public school textbook.
Yes.
So these are real world consequences. Now, these people are so foolish. The judiciary is so foolish that they will not teach intelligent design in schools because they say it's a religious claim. Actually, it's a philosophical claim. It's a philosophical claim that was made
Yeah.
hundreds of years before Christianity. And so the real problem is this philosophical illiteracy, which permeates the world of science and even has infected now the judiciary. Philosophical illiteracy. And so, as they say, where the rubber meets the road, if we're talking about real world effects, how this affects our society, how this affects what our children are taught in school, how this affects what you can legally say here or there, then the official government of science, if you can sort of use that term, those who legally, officially represent science are physicalists.
Yes. So you're saying there are essentially two class of science. One is like, okay, purely they are physicalist, and they don't interfere with what is philosophy, which is fine. They're not contaminating, they just do their business.
Yes,
But there
yes.
is a major class which impacts our lives or public life, is when these scientific information or scientists start influencing policy, judiciary, and public life, because then they
Education.
bring the whole thing as a reality, like ultimate reality, as you said, ultimate. This is what it is. There is nothing
Yes.
beyond it, right?
It's just like now in, I think, was it Alabama or Mississippi, they passed a law you have to put the 10 Commandments in public schools. And so, yes, if they just do science, there's nothing about a PhD in science. There's nothing about work in the field of science that tells you whether or not
Yeah.
the physical world as we know it came about by itself or was created by some intelligent being. There's nothing in science that will give you even a clue about that. And if it gives you any
Yeah.
clue, it's the mind-boggling sophistication that we find in microbiology, which actually, if anything, would lead you to conclude that it's much more likely it was true. But still, so what's happening is you take empirical science. I personally admire real science. I'm grateful for real science. I mean, maybe I'm alive today because of science. People I love, people in my family are alive today because of science. So I don't bite the hand that feeds me. I'm talking to you right now because of science.
Yeah.
And I can do my service to Krishna because of science, by all these technical things. So I think science is, when it's not used to destroy the world,
It was
you
great.
know,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I appreciate. So I'm not against science. What I'm against is scoundrels who are preaching religion in the name of science, who are exploiting the success of science to promote their own.
Ideologies like
Yeah,
the
I mean,
philosophy.
someone, like, to give an example of someone who's just like philosophically clownish, that Richard Dawkins.
Hmm.
I mean, from the point of view of academic philosophers, he's a clown because he says he begs the question, he contradicts. It's just, philosophically, he's just
Yeah.
absurd.
Hmm.
So what I'm saying is, let us move to the third stage of the dialectic. You have thesis, antithesis. The thesis was church contaminated science. The antithesis is atheism, a religion, a metaphysical. Atheism contaminated science. We need to move to just science, where you do your work, whether you're a physicist or a chemist or a biologist or an astronomer, whatever you are. Do your science. We'll be very grateful. Everyone will benefit by your work. But the moment you try to exploit the success of science to promote your religion, whether it's theism or atheism. That's not, for example, if I say, look at the complexity of just the human cell, which is mind boggling.
Yeah.
So if I say, look at the cell, and to me, it's obvious there's a God. But when I say that, I don't claim I'm speaking science. I'm saying right now, I am in a category called theology or philosophical theology. I'm not claiming that I'm doing empirical science. Similarly, if someone claims that evolution or whatever, the universe, if it came about by itself without any designer, at least don't be a scoundrel and admit right now I am not speaking science. I'm speaking my metaphysical religion. These are my beliefs. This is not empirical science. They don't make that distinction. That's the problem. It's cheating.
Yeah, that is true. Pretty much true. You summarized it. So with that, I think we will end here, and we will thank you so much for giving us time today and start this podcast. I know people may have a lot of questions. We touched so many things during this 1.5 hour discussion. But for them, for all of you who will be watching or who are watching right now, we'll be coming with more specific topics. This was very generic, and therefore it's very hard to discuss every statement we made. We could discuss hours and hours. So don't be disappointed. This is just a beginning. We'll keep on coming back with the more topics and very focused, maybe a specific, so that we can go in detail and discuss case studies, so that you can start more having a memorizing experience from this, story wise experience rather than an abstract of this topic. So thank you so much, Dr. H.D. Goswami, for joining. And with that, we'll end our call here. Thank you so much.